At 74 years old, Eleanor Grace Whitfield still made her bed every morning with military precision. Corners folded crisply, pillows arranged in a particular order that had become ritual over 4 decades. Arthur had teased her about it in the early years. You could sleep until noon and no one would know, he used to say. But Eleanor had always known. Discipline, her mother had told her, is the architecture of character. And so every morning at 6:30, Eleanor rose, made the bed, opened the curtains to whatever sky London was offering that day, and went downstairs to make 2 cups of tea. She had been making 2 cups of tea every morning for 42 years. On the morning she found Arthur dead in his armchair, she had already made both. She was carrying them upstairs on a small lacquered tray, the one with the blue herons on it, that she had bought at a market in Bath during their anniversary trip 20 years ago. When she saw him from the doorway and understood immediately, in the way that bodies sometimes understand before minds are ready to, that she would be drinking alone today and every day after. She had set the tray down very carefully on the hallway table. She had walked into the room and laid her hand against his cheek, which was still faintly warm. She had stood there for a long time in the gray February light with her hand against his face, and felt something she could not accurately name. It was not quite grief, though grief would come. It was not quite relief, though she would later examine that feeling with considerable honesty. It was something older and simpler than either. It was the sensation of a very long story, arriving at its final page and not being certain whether what came next would be better or worse. Only being certain that it would be different, and that different at 74 was frightening. She had called the ambulance. She had called the doctor. She had made one more cup of tea, just one this time, and she had sat in the kitchen and drunk it while the professionals filled the rooms of the house with their efficient compassion. Later, she would understand that the morning of Arthur's death was the last ordinary morning of a life she had believed was hers. Everything that followed would be extraordinary, in ways she had not imagined and could not have prepared for. But she didn't know that yet. As she sat at the kitchen table with her single cup and watched the light change, and thought about all the 2-cup mornings that would never come again. Arthur Whitfield had been one of London's most distinguished barristers for over 5 decades. He had taken silk in his early 40s, argued cases before the Supreme Court, and built a reputation for a particular quality of legal mind: meticulous, patient architecturally, precise in its reasoning, that made other barristers speak of him with a mixture of admiration and mild resentment reserved for people who were genuinely exceptional at something. When he died on that February morning at the age of 83, half of London's legal establishment made arrangements to attend his funeral at the Church of St. Mary the Virgin in Kensington, where the Whitfield family had worshipped for 3 generations, and where Arthur had served as a church warden for nearly 2 decades. The funeral was on a Thursday. The pews were full before 10 o'clock. Judges and Queen's Counsel and silks who had opposed Arthur across courtrooms for decades came in their dark coats and took their seats with the solemnity of people who understood that they were marking the end of a particular era. Former clients came. Senior partners from the chambers where Arthur had spent his career came. There were 3 members of Parliament, 2 circuit judges, and what appeared to be an entire floor of a city law firm clustered near the back in a corporate formation. Arthur's children from his first marriage sat in the front pew. Edward, 58, who had followed his father in the law but had settled for commercial practice rather than the bar, a distinction Arthur had never once mentioned but which Eleanor suspected had been a disappointment he had learned to carry without acknowledging. Edward had his father's bearing without quite his father's intelligence, and had compensated for this his entire adult life with an aggressive confidence that sometimes passed for authority in rooms that weren't paying close attention. Victoria, 55, who had married well twice and badly once in between, and whose social life in the better postcodes of London required the kind of sustained effort that most people reserved for professional careers. Victoria had her father's precision, but aimed it primarily at the management of other people's perceptions of her. She had arrived at the funeral in a coat that was exactly the right kind of expensive, visible to people who knew, invisible to people who didn't. James, 52, who had never quite found the thing he was supposed to be doing with his life, and had spent the last decade in various investment vehicles of ambiguous productivity. James was the kindest of the three, which was not saying a great deal, but Eleanor had always found him slightly less exhausting than his siblings. He had arrived at the church looking genuinely sad beneath his expensive suit, which she gave him credit for. They placed Eleanor in the second row. For space, Edward had explained, with the smooth efficiency of a man who had spent his career finding precise words for imprecise intentions. In case you have family members coming who need to sit with you. Eleanor had no family members coming. Her parents were 30 years gone. Her brother Peter had died of a cardiac event 6 years ago at a golf course in Dorset. The friends she had made in her 20s and 30s, the friends from before she became Mrs. Arthur Whitfield, had drifted away gradually over 4 decades. The way people drift when one of them builds a new life in a different world and can't quite hold on to both at once. She had acquaintances in abundance. She had colleagues of Arthur's wives whom she had entertained and organized and remembered birthdays for. She had the social network of a successful barrister's household, which is to say, she knew a great many people who would describe her as charming if asked, and could not have told you the names of her parents. She had no family members coming. The second row was a public statement delivered in the language of logistics. Eleanor had understood it immediately and had said nothing. 42 years of saying nothing about certain things had made her very good at it. The service was long, as services for distinguished men tend to be. Speaker after speaker rose to describe Arthur Whitfield, the legal mind, Arthur Whitfield, the mentor, Arthur Whitfield, the servant of justice, Arthur Whitfield, the devoted father who had raised 3 children after the early death of their mother and done so while maintaining a career of extraordinary demands. Not one speaker mentioned Arthur Whitfield, the husband. Not one person. Not the vicar who had known Arthur for 2 decades. Not the senior silk, who delivered the primary eulogy. Not the former client who spoke of Arthur's integrity, with such feeling that several people in the gallery reached for handkerchiefs. Not one person acknowledged the woman who had stood beside him for 42 years, who had managed his household and supported his career and organized the dinners that cemented his professional relationships and made sure his shirts were pressed, and his diary didn't double book, and his children had somewhere to sleep when they deigned to visit, who had loved him, as far as she could tell, honestly and without calculation, which was rarer than it should be, and which she had never, in 42 years, felt entirely thanked for. Invisible in life, more so in death. Eleanor sat in the second row with her hands folded in her lap, and looked at the back of Arthur's coffin and thought about the cup of tea with the herons on the tray. At the reception afterward, held at Victoria's Richmond home, which had been professionally cleaned and stocked with caterers whose minimalist canapes cost more per piece than Eleanor's weekly grocery shop, she found herself standing near the window with a glass of something sparkling that she didn't particularly want, watching the room conduct itself, with the practiced ease of people who had been attending these events all their lives. She overheard Victoria talking to a cluster of friends near the mantelpiece. "It's just so impossibly hard," Victoria was saying. Her eyes were dry. Eleanor noted this with the precision of someone who had watched Victoria perform grief at 2 of her 3 divorces and knew the difference between the real version and the social version. Losing Daddy. At least we have each other to get through it. The real family. She touched the arm of the woman beside her with practiced warmth. We'll manage somehow. The real family. as though the past 42 years had been an extended piece of amateur theater, in which Eleanor had been cast in a supporting role without understanding that the play was about something other than she thought it was. Eleanor finished her sparkling drink, set the glass on a passing tray, found her coat, and left before anyone felt obliged to say a formal goodbye. The reading of the will was scheduled for 10 o'clock on a Thursday morning, exactly 1 week after the funeral. It was held at the offices of Gerald Hawthorne, a solicitor of the old school, bow-tied, careful, and possessed of that particular quality, of deliberate slowness that very good lawyers use to make sure everything is understood before it is reacted to. Gerald's offices were in a Georgian building off Chancery Lane, the kind of building that smelled of old paper and beeswax and the accumulated seriousness of centuries of legal work. The conference room was paneled in dark wood with a long table down the center, and a window overlooking a small courtyard where a plane tree was just beginning to bud. Eleanor arrived 7 minutes early and sat alone on one side of the table, watching the courtyard and the tree and trying to convince her hands to be still. She had dressed carefully. The charcoal wool dress Arthur had always said made her look like herself, which she had taken as a compliment and which she suspected he had meant as one. Her white hair was arranged in the way she wore it for occasions that required a certain composure to be visible from the outside regardless of what was happening inside. She wore the small pearl earrings her mother had left her. She wore her wedding ring. She had told herself on the drive-in from Kensington that there was nothing to fear. 42 years, a life built together. Arthur had always been generous, not demonstratively, not the kind of man who announced his generosity, but consistently, reliably in the background the way foundations work. She would be provided for. Of course she would be provided for. Edward, Victoria, and James arrived together at 10:05, having made, she suspected, the calculation that arriving slightly late positioned them as people with more important places to be. Each had their own legal representative with them, solicitors who filed themselves against the far wall with the professional neutrality of people paid to be present rather than visible. The three siblings arranged themselves on the opposite side of the table from Eleanor, a formation that was not quite hostile enough to be called aggressive, but was not remotely accidental. Edward at the center, Victoria to his right, James to his left, a united front in dark wool. Gerald Hawthorne came in carrying a leather folder and a look that Eleanor, who had watched his face across many dinner tables over many years, recognized as the expression of a man who would rather be somewhere else doing something else, but would do this particular thing with complete professional integrity regardless. He began with the standard legal preamble, testamentary capacity, proper execution, the mechanics of the process in the calm, measured tone of someone reading a piece of music they have played many times and always find difficult in the same places. Then he opened the folder. Arthur Whitfield's estate, he said, is valued at approximately £9.4 million. This comprises the primary residence in Kensington, currently assessed at £3.2 million. Investment and retirement portfolios totaling £5.8 million. Various additional holdings and personal property. On her side of the table, Eleanor felt the tension in her shoulders begin, almost imperceptibly, to release. 9.4 million. She had not known the precise figure. Arthur had always managed the finances himself, with the same careful privacy he applied to most of his internal life. But 9.4 million was enough. More than enough. Whatever arrangement he had made, it would be sufficient. She was going to be all right. The primary residence in Kensington, Gerald continued, his voice taking on a quality that she had not heard before, a careful, deliberate flatness like a man walking across uncertain ground who has decided that steadiness is the best he can offer, is bequeathed in its entirety to Arthur's children from his first marriage. Edward Whitfield, Victoria Whitfield Grane, James Whitfield, to be divided equally among them or sold, as they determine appropriate. The release in Eleanor's shoulders reversed itself. The investment portfolios, totaling approximately £4.1 million, are similarly bequeathed equally to Edward, Victoria, and James Whitfield. The cold that began at the base of her spine was not quite like anything she had felt before. Not the cold of a winter room or a February wind. An interior cold, structural, as though the temperature of the thing holding her up had dropped several degrees. The retirement and pension accounts, Gerald continued, totaling approximately £1.7 million. Same distribution to the 3 children. Mrs. Whitfield. She heard her name in his voice and understood from the way he said it, from the slight softening, the fraction of additional breath before the words, that what was coming next required both of them to be very composed. "I must tell you," he said, "that I argued at some length against the language Arthur chose. For this portion of his will, he considered my objections and declined to revise it. I am legally required to read the verbatim text. I am genuinely sorry." He looked at her directly for a moment, not with pity, which she would not have accepted, but with something more like the look of one professional acknowledging another's difficulty. And then he looked down at the document. Arthur Morrison Whitfield states, in his own words, "My wife, Eleanor Grace Whitfield, has resided comfortably and without material want for 42 years entirely at my provision and expense. Throughout the duration of our marriage, she has enjoyed the benefit of my home, my professional standing, my social connections, and a manner and standard of living she could not have achieved or sustained independently. This constitutes, in my considered judgment, adequate and indeed generous compensation for the companionship she has provided and for the domestic management and household services she has performed throughout our marriage. I do not consider myself to carry any further financial obligation toward her." The words landed in the room the way very heavy objects land on very hard surfaces, without drama, with absolute finality. Companionship, domestic management, household services, financial obligation. 42 years. The 2 cups of tea every morning. The dinners for judges and clients and colleagues that ran to 11 or 12 people and required 3 days of preparation and an elegance that appeared effortless, precisely because Eleanor had made it so. The garden she had built from bare soil, the household she had run, the man she had loved, whatever that word meant across a life this long. However complicated and qualified that feeling had become over 4 decades, however much silence and distance had grown up around its edges, she had loved him. And he had written this, had sat at his desk in his private study and written these words, and then given them to his solicitor to read aloud in front of his children, while they sat across a conference table from the woman who had made his bed, and poured his tea and kept his world in order since 1981. Across the table, Edward was studying the grain of the polished wood with careful attention. Victoria had produced a small mirror from her bag and appeared to be confirming that her lipstick remained intact. James was looking at his phone with a focused expression of someone who knows they are being observed and has decided that indifference is the safest performance. Gerald cleared his throat quietly and continued. Arthur's will provides one further bequest for Eleanor Whitfield, one property located at Wren Cottage, Ashbourne Lane, in the village of Landmere, Wales, along with all contents currently therein and all associated land. Mrs. Whitfield is requested to vacate the Kensington residence within 30 days of the date of Arthur's death, as that property is required by the principal heirs for their use or disposition at their sole discretion. Additionally, Gerald said, Arthur asked that this envelope be given to you personally. He slid a brown manila envelope across the table. His hand, Eleanor noticed, was not entirely steady. She found that she was grateful for this small human evidence. that the words he had been required to read had cost him something too. Inside the envelope, one iron key, heavy and dark with age, the kind of key that belongs to a different century than the one they were sitting in, and one sheet of cream stationery, Arthur's own, the expensive Smythson paper he had used for personal correspondence for as long as she could remember, with his handwriting on it, small, precise, and unmistakably his. Wren Cottage, Ashbourne Lane, Lanmere, Wales. Eleanor, go there. Go as soon as you can. You will understand everything once you arrive. I cannot tell you before. They were always watching, always looking for reasons to challenge. Trust me one final time, my love. I am so very sorry. Oh, my love, always. Arthur, trust me one final time. After he had sat at his desk and written her out of his life in the language of a business contract. After he had left her with a house she had never heard of in a village she could not have, placed on a map, while his children divided £8.5 million between them. After 42 years of trust that had apparently been given to someone keeping secrets. Trust me one final time. Victoria's voice was professionally warm. Daddy mentioned the Welsh property once or twice over the years. Inherited it from some elderly relative in the 70s, I think. He always said it was practically uninhabitable. A drafty old ruin in the middle of nowhere. The property taxes were more trouble than the thing was worth. She met Eleanor's eyes with an expression of practiced sympathy. But at least it's a roof, Eleanor. That's something. You'll be able to sell it and have a little nest egg for a few years. We'll need to coordinate the handover of the Kensington keys, Edward said, already scrolling. Do something on his phone. We're planning to list immediately. The market in that neighborhood is very strong right now, and we want to get the estate agent in as soon as possible. I assume 30 days is workable. 30 days, Gerald said, is what the will specifies. Mrs. Whitfield is entitled to every one of them. Of course, Edward said smoothly. We're not unreasonable people. Take your full 30 days. Eleanor, we completely understand this is a significant transition. Eleanor stood. Her legs felt strange beneath her, as though the floor had become a slightly different substance than it had been when she sat down. She picked up the brown envelope. She put the key and Arthur's letter back inside it. She walked to the door with her chin level and her shoulders carrying the particular posture of someone who has decided that composure is a form of survival and intends to survive. Mrs. Whitfield, Gerald said from behind her. He was on his feet. Please, if you need anything in the legal process, anything at all, call me on my direct line, not the office number. This is my personal card. I mean what I say. She took the card without looking at it. She nodded once. She did not trust her voice sufficiently to use it. She made it to the lift. She made it through the lobby with its beeswax smell and its accumulated centuries. She made it to the pavement of Chancery Lane, where the plane trees were doing their best in the gray February air. She made it to the car park at the end of the block where her 12-year-old Volvo had waited with the patience of a loyal animal that asks very little and deserves more. She got in. She put her hands on the wheel. She stared at the concrete wall in front of her, and then the composure, which had been a structure she had built and maintained for 42 years by sheer application of will and habit, came apart all at once, in the particular way of structures that have been quietly undermined for a very long time. She sat in that car park and wept with a completeness she had not permitted herself in decades. She wept for the 2 cups of tea, for the garden she had built with her hands, for the second row at the funeral, for the word compensation, for 42 years of believing herself loved when perhaps she had only been efficiently accommodated, for all the things she had never said because she had believed, with the faith of someone who had no other religion, that staying quiet and staying steady, and staying was enough to constitute a life. When there was nothing left, she dried her face with a careful hand, started the car, and drove back to Kensington to begin the process of disappearing. The 30 days that followed were an education in the particular cruelty that comes not from hatred, but from indifference. Edward, Victoria, and James came to the Kensington townhouse with the frequency and purposefulness of an occupying force who have not yet quite completed their administration of a territory they already consider theirs. They came with contractors who knocked on walls and talked about structural reconfiguration. They came with estate agents who measured rooms and calculated yield per square foot. They came with interior designers who spoke about the kitchen and the drawing room and the hallway and what each could become, with the right investment and vision, while Eleanor sat in those rooms, still present, still living there, still using the kitchen and sitting in the drawing room and walking through the hallway. Every single morning on her way to make a single cup of tea, no one asked her to leave a room. No one spoke directly to her unless logistics required it. They simply proceeded as though she were a temporary technical difficulty, acknowledged when absolutely necessary, otherwise ignored. One Thursday morning, she was at the kitchen table with her breakfast when Victoria arrived, with a designer whose portfolio included several high-profile Kensington conversions. They moved through the kitchen with measuring tape and digital camera, discussing the existing layout with the frank assessment of surgeons examining a patient. They intend to significantly alter. This wall comes down, Victoria said, gesturing at the wall against which Eleanor had placed a set of shelves 20 years ago, shelves that now held the cookbooks she had accumulated. Over 4 decades, the Lou Creuset she had bought at the Borough Market on a cold Saturday. In the year that Edward got married, the small herbs and terracotta pots she kept on the sill for cooking. Open it all the way through to the dining room. That's what this space needs. Light, volume, flow. The designer nodded, making notes. It would photograph beautifully for the listing. Very much what buyers in this market respond to. And we'll want to strip back the garden, Victoria continued, without looking at Eleanor. It's overplanted. Very personal taste. We need it to read as neutral, aspirational. The garden. 30 years of Eleanor's hands. The roses she had started from bare root and coaxed through 3 hard winters before they gave her their first flowers. The espaliered apple against the south wall that had taken a decade to train. The climbing hydrangea by the back gate. The herb beds she could navigate in the dark. By smell alone, rosemary here, thyme there, the sharp green of flat parsley by the tap. That garden was the one space in the house that had felt wholly, unambiguously hers, where she had not been performing or accommodating or managing or making smooth, where she had simply been a person who loved growing things. Now was overplanted, very personal taste, a problem to be neutralized. Eleanor put down her toast. She picked up her tea. She looked out the window at the garden, where the early spring was beginning to show itself. Snowdrops nearly finished now. The first crocuses opening, the rose stems brightening to red at the tip, and said nothing. Because 42 years of swallowing her voice had made the muscle very strong. And because she was beginning to understand she was saving something. She did not yet know what she was saving it for, but she could feel it accumulating. The nights were the worst. Lying in the bedroom she had shared with Arthur in the high bed with its white linen, which she continued to make every morning with military precision, because discipline is the architecture of character, and she was not going to abandon her architecture. Just because the walls around it were coming down, she would stare at the ceiling and perform a very thorough accounting of her situation. She was 74 years old. She had no income of her own. The last time she had held a job, in any formal sense, had been before her marriage. She had worked as a personal assistant to a chamber's administrator, competent work that she had performed well and which had led in one of those unremarkable sequences that turn out to determine everything, to meeting Arthur at a function for the Inns of Court, where he had been the most interesting person in the room, and she had been the youngest person by a decade, and he had asked her what she thought of the speaker. And she had told him honestly, and he had looked at her as though she had done something unexpected and excellent, and everything had followed from that. She had given up that job when they married. Arthur had not asked her to. He had simply described the life they would lead together in such a way that it was clear, where her contribution was expected to be directed, and she had agreed because she loved him, and because his life had seemed, at 29, like an extraordinary invitation to something larger and more significant than she could have built alone. Now, at 74, the question of what she could build alone was not theoretical. She had made calls, quietly, to the estate agents in Landmere whose number she had found, by searching online from her phone under the covers, not wanting the search to show up on the household computer that Edward had already asked for the password to. An old cottage in Landmere, perhaps half an acre of land. If she was very lucky and the market was cooperative, 80 to 100,000 pounds. At 74, living carefully, that was perhaps 4 or 5 years of modest security. And then the question of the end of those years was a door she could not yet bring herself to open and look through. On some nights, the fear was so complete that it occupied every corner of her mind. And she would get up and go to the kitchen at 2 in the morning and make tea, and sit in the dark and go through the arithmetic again, searching for an error she had made, a variable she had miscounted, something that would make the numbers come out differently. They never came out differently. On other nights, the fear curdled into something sharper and hotter. She would lie rigid in the dark and think, how dare he, how dare Arthur write those words? Compensation for domestic services, financial obligation, as though she had been an employee on a long-term contract that had reached its natural end rather than a woman who had given the better part of her one life to loving him. She had given up her independence for him. She had given up her friendships gradually, over years, not because he had asked her to, but because being Mrs. Arthur Whitfield had required a particular kind of devotion to his world that left insufficient room for her own. She had given up the possibility of having children of her own, not because Arthur had forbidden it, never that, but because the situation she had married into had made it feel impossible, had made her feel from the very first year that proposing to add to the family would be a provocation too far, that the 3 children already resentful of her presence were already more than the situation could hold. She had given up the version of herself who had existed before 1981, the woman who had opinions and habits and friendships in a small flat in Islington, and a life that was entirely uncomplicated hers, and she had done it willingly, with love, believing it was an exchange rather than a surrender. But on those 2 in the morning nights, she wondered whether she had been wrong about the nature of the transaction from the very beginning. On day 27, she overheard a conversation she was not meant to hear. She had come downstairs for water at a time when she had believed the house was empty. Edward and Victoria were in the dining room, their voices carrying easily through the silence of the house at 10 o'clock in the evening. The Welsh property is worth 60,000 at most, Victoria was saying. Probably less. He felt guilty. That's all it was. 42 years is a long time to keep someone in good domestic service, and father was always susceptible to guilt. She should be grateful it's anything at all, Edward replied. Women her age, no employment history, no family, no real assets. The outcome without that cottage is a local authority waiting list for sheltered housing. At least she can sell the thing and have a few years of modest independence before. He left the before unfinished, but Eleanor heard its completion in the silence. I suppose, Victoria said, and there was a sound of glass on wood, a drink being set down. She wasn't unpleasant. I'll give her that. She ran the house well enough. Eleanor stood in the hallway outside the dining room, with her glass of water, and felt the 42 years rise up in her like a tide. She thought about all the dinners, all the logistical miracles performed silently, and made it look like natural events, all the difficult telephone calls managed, All the times Arthur's children had arrived with their complicated emotional weather, and she had navigated it with a skill and patience that a barrister of his sophistication should have recognized for the extraordinary feat it was. Run the house well enough. She went back upstairs without getting her water. She sat on the edge of the bed. She held her hands in her lap and looked at them and thought, I'm not going to cry. I'm going to survive this. And I'm going to start surviving it tonight. She began making a list of everything she knew she could do. It was longer than she had expected. On her final morning in Kensington, Eleanor rose at 6:30, as she had always done, and made the bed with military precision. She moved through the house for the last time, with the particular attention of someone memorizing something they will not see again. Not sentimentally, practically. She wanted to know exactly what she was leaving, so that she would not romanticize it later and wish for a version of it that had not existed. The bedroom was a room, for walls and high ceilings and the pale light of a March morning. It had never been her room in the way that the word her actually means. It had been Arthur's room that she had been permitted to share, in a house that had been Arthur's house before she arrived and would be someone else's soon. The drawing room with the good furniture and the curtains she had chosen herself. The color had taken her 3 months to get right, a particular shade of deep teal that Arthur had called excessive and their guest had called magnificent. Those curtains would be gone within a year. Open plan, clean and contemporary. That's what buyers respond to. The dining room, the hallway, the small sitting room at the back that Eleanor had claimed as her reading room by virtue of simply inhabiting it consistently enough that everyone understood it was hers or near enough. The kitchen. She paused here. She made herself one last cup of tea in this kitchen. Standing at the counter, she had stood at every morning for 4 decades, looking out at the garden where the March sky was pale and the early magnolia was opening its first flowers, extravagant, impractical, heartbreakingly beautiful flowers. That lasted 10 days if you were lucky, and which she had planted anyway, because some things are worth having precisely because they don't last long enough. Then she went out into the garden with her tea and stood among her roses and breathed the air of a March morning in a garden she had made from nothing. And she permitted herself 5 minutes of something that was not quite grief and not quite anger, but partook of both. Then she went inside, rinsed the cup, set it on the draining board, and loaded the last of her boxes into the Volvo. 3 suitcases of clothing, 2 boxes of genuinely personal possessions, her mother's letters, her brother's photograph from a holiday in Crete, the summer before he died, the 2 of them squinting into the sun, laughing at something. Neither of them could now remember. Her grandmother's copy of Middlemarch, the pages soft with age, the spine repaired with brown tape by someone long before her. A folder of her own paintings from an evening class she had taken in the late 80s. Watercolors, mostly landscapes, mostly the garden, decent work that she had never shown anyone, because showing people your paintings felt like showing them something private. The totality of Eleanor Grace Whitfield, reduced to what could be carried in one trip. She stood beside the car for a moment and thought, this is who I am when everything else is removed. And then, perhaps this is closer to who I actually am than any of the rest of it ever was. Edward arrived at 1:30, 15 minutes before she had planned to leave, which she suspected was intentional. He was carrying a clipboard, which was either practical or a statement, and possibly both. The removal team comes at 2, he said, not meeting her eyes. I'll need the house keys. Before you leave. All sets. I'm taking them to the estate agent this afternoon. They want to get in for photographs by end of the week. Eleanor closed the boot of the Volvo. She turned to look at him. Edward, she said, and something in her voice made him look at her. Actually look, not the managed glance that was his usual engagement with her, but look in the way that people look when they sense they're about to be told something true. Do you have any understanding at all of what it is to give someone 42 years of your life? and discover that they considered it as service rendered? That the sum of everything you gave, not the domestic work, not the management of the household, but the actual devotion, the actual love, that all of it could be reduced to compensation. That word. Do you have any idea what that word cost me? Edward's face colored in a way that told her she had found something real beneath the polish. Father left you a property. You're not receiving nothing. Your father left me a mystery, Eleanor said. A house I've never seen in a village I've never visited, handed over with a key that looks like it belongs in a museum. You and Victoria. And James received millions of pounds in this house and the satisfaction of knowing. Your father considered you his legacy, his bloodline, his continuation. I received a rusty key and 30 days to cease to exist from the only place I've called home. In 42 years. So no, Edward, I don't think you have any genuine understanding of this. She got into the Volvo before he could find an adequate response. The brown envelope was on the passenger seat. Arthur's letter was inside it. Her navigation showed the address. Ashbourne Lane, Landmere, Wales. 4 hours and 30 minutes. She sat for a moment with her hands on the wheel, looking at the house. Her house, that had never been her house, that she had made beautiful and managed and filled with flowers and good meals and the sustained invisible effort of someone who believed the work itself was a form of love. And she made herself a promise that she intended to keep. Whatever she found in Wales, whatever state Wren Cottage was in, whether it was habitable or a ruin, whether it was worth the drive or worth nothing at all, she would survive it. She had survived 42 years of quiet erasure. She could survive an honest ruin. She started the car. She drove away from Kensington. She did not look in the rearview mirror. The drive to Wales takes the traveler through a gradual unfolding of landscape, from city to suburb to smaller town to the open country of the Midlands, and then beyond Shrewsbury into the particular quality of Welsh air and Welsh light that feels to those arriving from the east like a different agreement between the earth and the sky. The hills grow steeper and greener. The roads grow narrower. The trees along the verges are older. The villages appear less frequently and seem, when they do, more self-contained, places that have decided what they are and are not especially interested. In revision, Eleanor had not been to Wales in perhaps 20 years. Arthur had not been a country person. He had been a London person in the particular total way of those for whom the city is not where they happen to live, but what they are made of. He had found rural landscapes, beautiful in the abstract and slightly inconvenient in practice. The weekends when he disappeared, the monthly trips she had packed his bag for, kissed him goodbye at the door of, never questioned. He had described them variously as visits to colleagues, fishing trips, time he needed to decompress away from the demands of a professional life that required constant performance. He had been coming to Wales. She turned this fact over as she drove, the way you turn a stone over to see what is underneath it. 42 years of monthly trips. 42 years of an address she had never been given. A key she had never held. A house that had apparently been prepared slowly and deliberately for a moment that Arthur had known would come and which he had not been brave enough. His word, she would discover, to tell her about in advance. She crossed into Wales in the late afternoon, when the sun was beginning to lean west, and the light along the hilltops was the particular gold that only exists for an hour. On clear days in early spring, she drove through market towns that were waking up, from winter and through villages that seemed to be considering the matter. Her navigation took her off the A roads and onto B roads and then onto roads that had apparently decided a number was unnecessary. Landmere appeared in a valley she had not seen until she was almost in it. The road dropped suddenly between hillsides thick with oak and ash, and there below was the village, small, dense, huddled around its square, with the particular solidity of communities that have been in the same place for a very long time, and see no compelling reason to be elsewhere. A church with a square tower, a pub with smoke from its chimney, a bakery, a post office, a small cluster of shops, along a high street no longer than a few hundred feet. And as Eleanor drove slowly down that high street, following the navigation's directions, she noticed the people noticing her, not in the way of tourists being clocked by locals. Something different. The elderly man with a newspaper outside the post office, who lowered it and watched her car, passed with an expression she couldn't quite read, recognition, or its expectation. The woman in the bakery doorway, who dried her hands on her apron and nodded slowly, as though confirming something to herself. The group of children spilling out of a doorway, who stopped and looked in the focused, unembarrassed way of children who have not yet learned that staring is rude and who therefore often see more clearly than their elders. The navigation directed her off the high street onto a lane that ran behind the church, and then became a track of compressed earth and loose stone leading down into a fold of the valley, where the trees closed in on both sides with the deliberateness of something planned. Ancient trees, oak and ash and rowan, whose canopies interlocked overhead, to make a tunnel of bare branches through which the last of the afternoon light fell, in angular, shifting patterns across her bonnet and windscreen. Eleanor drove slowly, navigating the ruts with the care the narrow clearance of the Volvo required. The track wound for perhaps a mile, dropping gradually, the village sounds fading behind her, and the sounds of the valley, wind in the high branches, a stream somewhere below, bird song she could not identify, filling in the silence they left. Then the navigation spoke in its cheerful, oblivious way. You have arrived at your destination. Eleanor stopped the car. She sat with the engine running for a long moment, looking at her hands on the wheel. She thought, whatever it is what it is. She thought, Victoria said it was uninhabitable. She thought, I have nowhere else to go. And then she looked up. The track had opened into a broad clearing sheltered on three sides by those old trees, which stood at its perimeter like a patient assembly of witnesses. And in the center of the clearing was a house. Not a ruin, not a derelict shell, not the falling apart wreck Victoria had described. With such confidence, the confidence, Eleanor thought now, of someone who had never seen it, and had simply decided that whatever Arthur had left to Eleanor could not be worth having. It was a cottage built from Welsh stone, gray and amber and the color of old rust. 2 stories under a slate roof that was intact, solid, not a tile displaced that she could see. Casement windows with thick frames and old wavy glass that caught the light and held it briefly before releasing it in slightly altered form. A low stone wall enclosing what had once been a formal garden, overgrown now, given over to years of ungoverned growth, but beautifully so in the way that things become. Beautiful when they're left to follow their own logic for long enough. Roses, old, structural ones, not modern floribundas, but proper climbing roses, whose canes made architectural arches over the paths, had run wild and filled the frames. Arthur had presumably built for them with a freedom that was also, Eleanor thought, a kind of excellence. Stone paths between the beds were partially covered by moss, and by the encroachment of time and creeping oregano that had escaped their beds, and occupied the cracks with the quiet persistence of plants that know exactly what they want. A fountain in the center of the garden, stone, simple, with a shallow bowl, that had weathered to the color of the surrounding landscape, stood dry and still, but was intact, structurally sound, waiting. The front door was oak, heavy, set under a small porch supported by carved stone columns, whose detail she couldn't make out from the car, but which told her that whoever had built this place had believed it was worth building properly. Eleanor sat in the car and looked at it for a long time. She felt something she had not expected to feel. Not relief exactly, not surprise exactly, something more like the sensation of a question you have been carrying for a very long time, being answered in a language you didn't know you already spoke. She was still sitting in the car when she heard footsteps on the track behind her. The woman coming toward her was perhaps 70, stout, unhurried, wearing a wax jacket over a wool dress, carrying a covered basket with the ease of someone for whom this walk is entirely familiar. She came up to the car and stopped and looked at Eleanor through the window with an expression of complete and uncomplicated certainty. "You'll be Eleanor," she said. Not a question. Eleanor opened the car door and stood up on legs that were less steady than she would have liked. "How did you know?" she said. The woman smiled. Not the social smile of city people, not the professionally deployed warmth of someone performing friendliness for reasons adjacent to the genuine article. A simple, direct smile like a door opening. "We've been watching for you," she said. "Arthur told us you'd come. He described your car. He said you might arrive quite some time after he'd gone, that you'd need 30 days to settle his estate before you could come out to us. He said to keep watching regardless, that you'd get here when you got here, and when you did, you'd need someone to tell you what you'd found." She held out the basket. "Bread from this morning. Butter, eggs, milk, a good hard cheese. There's food in the pantry that will last you months, but nothing fresh. I thought you want fresh. I medititsus. I run the bakery in the village. Arthur bought bread from me every visit." Eleanor took the basket. She felt strange, dislocated, as though the world had rearranged itself slightly while she was driving, and she was now in a version of it that operated by slightly different rules. "Arthur came here?" She heard the bewilderment in her own voice. "He never mentioned this place. Not once in 42 years. Not a word." Meredith's expression shifted into something that held both understanding and sorrow, in the equal proportions of someone who has thought carefully about how to speak the truth kindly. "He came every month," she said, "sometimes more often. He maintained the cottage, kept the garden as best he could, spent time here quietly. He told us, the village, we all knew Arthur. He was part of this place. He told us that when he died, his wife Eleanor would eventually arrive. He said you wouldn't know about it beforehand. He said it was the most important secret he'd ever kept and the one he was most ashamed of, that keeping it had been the hardest thing he'd been asked to do, and that he hoped when you understood the reason you would forgive him." "My protection?" Eleanor said slowly. "From what?" "From his children from his first marriage," Meredith said. "He told us they'd never accepted you, that they'd resented his marriage to you from the very beginning, that if they knew this property existed and was intended for you, they would challenge it through every legal avenue available, until they found one that worked, and that Arthur understood legal avenues very well indeed. So he removed this property from their reach before they could ever lay hands on it. He placed it in your name before your marriage made it complicated. He hid it from everyone, including you, because the only way to protect it was to make sure no one who would use it against you could know it existed." She began walking toward the cottage, gesturing for Eleanor to follow. "Coming out of the cold. The house is unlocked. Arthur never locked it. He said the village would take care of what was his and what was yours, and that if anyone needed shelter and the cottage was empty, they were welcome. That's who he was, at least here in Lamere. Perhaps I should say, that's who he let himself be. He was a different man here than the one London knew." Eleanor followed her up the stone path. She felt it solid and level beneath her feet, well-maintained, not a stone loose, toward the heavy oak door. Meredith used the iron key from Eleanor's envelope, and it turned in the lock. With the smooth ease of a mechanism regularly oiled, recently maintained, the door opened inward on its old hinges with barely a sound. "Welcome," Meredith said softly, stepping aside. Arthur called it the sanctuary. He called it that from quite early on. He said it was the only place he felt like himself. "Welcome home, Eleanor." Eleanor crossed the threshold. She stopped in the entrance and stood very still and let the room come to her, the way you let your eyes adjust to a different kind of light. The interior was warm, a warmth that spoke of good insulation and a heating system that had been recently and properly maintained, not the grudging warmth of a house that has been kept barely above damp, but the warmth of a place that expects to be inhabited. The floors were wide Welsh slate, worn smooth and dark with centuries of use, with rugs laid across them in deep blues and the amber of bracken in autumn. The walls were plastered, painted a warm white that in the afternoon light through the old glass took on a golden quality that made the room feel lit from within. A fireplace built from the same stone as the outer walls dominated one end of the room. A deep hearth, an iron grate, a carved oak mantel that bore the patina of genuine age. Around the fireplace, two armchairs positioned for conversation and a settle, covered in aged leather that had worn to the color of old honey. Bookshelves built into the alcoves on either side of the chimney breast, filled. She would examine the titles later, but from here she could see that the books were real books, read books, books that had been opened and handled and returned to their shelves, not for decoration, but because someone lived with them. And on every surface, on every wall, on the shelves where books were not, arranged and framed with the care of someone for whom each image was a specific, chosen thing. Photographs of Eleanor. She stood in the doorway of Arthur Whitfield's secret room and looked at her own face, looking back at her from every direction. Eleanor on their wedding day. She had forgotten she had been that young, had forgotten that particular quality of nervous, radiant hope she could see in her own expression. The expression of someone standing at the beginning of something they cannot yet see the end of. Eleanor in the Kensington garden, kneeling in the soil of the herb bed, her hands dark with earth, wearing the old shirt she had ruined irreparably in her first summer of serious gardening, and had kept for that purpose ever since. Her face was turned slightly to the side, not looking at the camera, and she was smiling at something beyond the frame. A smile she recognized as genuine because it was the private kind, the kind that happens before you know you're being watched. Eleanor at a gallery, standing in front of a large canvas. She recognized the Tate Modern, a visit they had made perhaps 15 years ago, a Sunday afternoon when the city was quiet. She was looking at the painting with an intensity she had not known she wore on her face. In public, she had not known Arthur had taken this photograph. Eleanor reading in the library of the Kensington house, the good chair, the afternoon light, with the particular quality of stillness that descends on people who are genuinely inside a book, rather than just moving their eyes across the surface of one. Eleanor asleep in an armchair that she now recognized as the armchair to her left in this very room, which meant he had brought her here once on some weekend visit she could not now recall. Or perhaps she was sleeping so deeply she had no memory of it, which might have been the point. Might have been a visit where he had simply wanted her present in the place he was preparing for her, even if she couldn't yet know what the place was. Eleanor at 60, at 55, at 47, at 39, at 31, barely 2 years into the marriage, already herself and already his subject, already being watched with this quality of sustained, private, devoted attention. He loved you very much, Meredith said quietly from behind her. There was no sentiment in her voice, just the flat certainty of a fact so obvious it required no elaboration. Anyone who came into this room understood it within moments. He built this room around you, effectively. Every photograph chosen, every frame selected. He used to rearrange them when he came to stay, add new ones, move others, spend hours on the arrangement. He called it keeping faith with what was true. Eleanor sat down on the settle before her legs made the decision for her. She looked at the photographs. She looked at her own face repeated around the room. She looked at the evidence of 42 years of being loved in complete secret by someone who had been too afraid to love her in public with the same completeness. And then she wept, not the controlled, efficient weeping of the car park in Chancery Lane, not the held-in, carefully managed emotion of the second row at Arthur's funeral, but the real kind that comes from below the ribcage, that doesn't care who is watching, that has been stored under pressure for a very long time and has finally found an exit. Meredith sat down beside her, not close enough to intrude, close enough to be present, and put one hand briefly on Eleanor's arm, and then removed it and sat quietly, while Eleanor wept herself empty in the warm room, full of her own face. When it was over, Meredith made tea in the kitchen. She knew the kitchen, knew where everything was, which told Eleanor something about how long she had been part of the custodianship of this place, and brought it back in cups that were plain, good, warm. They sat with their tea, and Meredith began to tell her about the cottage. The property, she said, had been well maintained through a fund Arthur had established, with the local bank in Lamere. Property taxes, utilities, structural maintenance, repairs, all managed automatically, all paid through the fund, which Arthur had capitalized, sufficiently to run for the next 50 years without requiring any action from Eleanor. The heating system had been serviced the previous autumn. The roof had been repointed in 3 places 4 years ago. The plumbing was sound. The cottage itself had been cleaned and prepared in the past 2 weeks. Meredith and 2 other women from the village had come in after Arthur's death, when they had understood that Eleanor would be coming, and had aired it, cleaned it, laid in supplies, put fresh linen on the bed upstairs. Eleanor looked at her. "He told you," she said. "He told you he was dying?" "He came in January," Meredith said, "and sat in my bakery for 2 hours one afternoon, which was longer than he usually stayed. He said he was not well. He said it was his heart. He said he wanted to be sure the cottage was in good order because it wouldn't be long before his wife would be coming to see it for the first time without him there to explain it. He said he was sorry he hadn't managed to bring me here himself to show me what it was. He said there were things he hadn't been brave enough to do, and that list was one of them. He didn't seem frightened," she added. "He seemed resolved, like someone who has finished a long project and is at peace with how it has turned out, even if they won't see the end of it." "Let me show you the rest of the house," Meredith said. "Then I'll go and let you begin to make sense of all of it. But there is one room you especially need to see. He left you something there. He was very specific that you would find it yourself. In his study, on the desk. The kitchen," Meredith showed her, "was everything Eleanor had glimpsed from the doorway. And more. It was a room that had been designed by someone who understood cooking. Not the cooking of people who prepare simple nourishment, but the cooking of someone who understood it as one of the primary civilized arts. The range is a good one, not new, but well maintained. The surfaces were thick Welsh slate, cool and permanent. The farmhouse sink was deep enough to do serious work in. Open shelving held china. That was simple and beautiful, cream and blue, handmade, the glaze slightly uneven, in the way of things made by hand. Copper pots on iron hooks. A herb garden in terracotta pots on the windowsill above the sink, currently dormant from winter but alive, soil damp, recently tended. Upstairs, 3 bedrooms. The largest looked over the clearing and the valley beyond it. The casement window, framing a view that in the fading afternoon light had the quality of a painting whose scale you cannot quite grasp from reproduction. More photographs of Eleanor here, dozens of them, the walls of the bedroom, carrying years of her face in seasons and moods and circumstances and ages. The maintenance fund covers everything, Meredith confirmed again as they came back down. You will never receive a bill for this place. Arthur structured it so that you would never have to worry about whether you could afford to stay here. He said that the greatest fear of women in your situation, and he was very specific about this, as though he had thought about it at length, was being unable to hold onto a place. He said he wanted you to know, from the very first night, that this place could not be taken from you. "Then why keep it from me?" Eleanor said. "For 42 years. Why let me sit in that office and believe he had written me out of his life when all along she already knew the beginning of the answer. Meredith confirmed the rest of it. His children would have challenged it. She said simply. He was a barrister. He knew exactly how estates are contested. He knew that if excuse me, if Edward had known about this property, his solicitors would have argued. Marital asset, community property, division of estate, anything they could find. And they might have found something that worked. So Arthur made sure there was nothing to find. He placed this property in your name as a gift in 1983 before the marriage. Could be argued to make it a joint asset. He covered his tracks completely. He kept this secret from everyone except Gerald Hawthorne, and one reason he trusted Gerald Hawthorne was that the man had the integrity not to speak even under pressure. She paused at a door beneath the staircase that Eleanor had not noticed. Small, wooden, unremarkable. The kind of door that might lead to a cupboard. She opened it. The study was perhaps 10 feet by 12 with no window. The walls on 3 sides were lined floor to ceiling with built-in shelves. And on those shelves, arranged with a meticulous, indexed order of a practicing barrister's files, were document boxes, ring binders, folders, and sealed envelopes, all labeled in Arthur's unmistakable, precise handwriting. The fourth wall held a beautiful old mahogany desk, Georgian, she thought. The kind of desk that takes a century to achieve its particular quality of weight and presence, with a green-shaded banker's lamp over it and a leather chair drawn up to it, that bore in its worn surface the impression of someone who had sat in it very many times over very many years. And in the center of the desk, in the precise center, positioned with the deliberateness of someone who had staged this moment carefully and wanted the staging to be understood, a thick cream envelope, my beloved Eleanor written across the front in Arthur's hand. Meredith stopped in the doorway. That is what everything else was in service of, she said quietly. That is what he most wanted. You to find. I'll be in the kitchen. Take whatever time you need. Eleanor stood at the desk for a long moment. She looked at her name in his handwriting. She looked at the shelves of documents that represented 42 years of a legal career, and whatever else they contained. She looked at the lamp, at the worn chair, at the desk itself, at the object that had been the center of gravity of Arthur's private world, the room he had occupied for 40 years of monthly visits, the place he had sat, when he was not performing or managing or being the barrister or the father, the place he had been simply himself. She sat down in the chair. It was comfortable in the particular way of things made for use. She picked up the envelope. The paper was heavy and cool in her hands. He had sealed it with wax, blue wax, pressed with the signet ring he had worn on his right hand for as long as she had known him, the ring whose origin he had never explained, in which she had never pushed him on because there had always seemed to be time to ask. And time, she now understood, had been less abundant than it appeared. She broke the seal. She drew out the pages, 6 of them, covered on both sides, in Arthur's small, deliberate, perfectly legible handwriting. My dearest Eleanor, my only Eleanor, if you're reading this, I have died and you have come a Landmere and found the cottage. The fact that you are in the study tells me the cottage has done what I hoped it would do, told you enough to make you want to understand the rest. I am deeply, profoundly, and entirely sorry that it had to be this way. I am sorry that you sat in Gerald Hawthorne's office and heard yourself described, in the language I was required to use in order for the will to serve its actual purpose. I am sorry you heard those words, compensation, domestic services, financial obligation, applied to the 42 years of your life that you gave to me. I need to explain those words. I need to explain all of it. Edward, Victoria, and James had solicitors on standby throughout the last decade of my life, prepared to challenge any estate planning that they felt diminished their inheritance. They made this clear to me, not in words, because my children were careful, not to say anything that could be used against them, but in the way careful people make things clear, without saying them. I understood the threat. I understand threats. I have spent my career recognizing them in every form. If my will had expressed what I actually felt for you, if it had used the language of love rather than the language of service, they would have challenged it on the grounds that the bequest to you was excessive, emotionally motivated, and made at the expense of blood heirs. They would have argued that my affection for you had compromised my judgment. So I wrote the will to give them no such argument. I gave them the visible wealth, and I described you in the terms of the transaction. They had always understood our marriage to be. I let them believe they had one. And in doing so, I protected you from the only challenge they had the standing to make. Because what I left you is not subject to their challenge. It was never theirs to challenge. This cottage was conveyed to you as a gift in September of 1983. Your name only. No marital link. The documentation is in the first filing cabinet. The entire legal structure complete and watertight. Gerald Hawthorne has a duplicate set in his safe, and he has instructions regarding their use. No court in this country can reach this property. It is yours absolutely. The cottage sits on 184 acres of protected valley land. I had it assessed by 2 independent surveyors 14 months ago. Its value to conservation organizations, and 3 of them have already expressed interest, is in the region of £2.8 million. To keep it as it is, as a private residence, is your right and your choice entirely. The maintenance fund I have established will cover all expenses for the next 50 years. You will never pay a bill in connection with this property. You will never need to worry about whether you can afford to stay. The study in which you are sitting holds the documentation of most of my professional life. 50 years of meticulous record-keeping by a barrister who understood that information is the one form of capital that cannot be inflated away. I never used the sensitive material. I want to be clear about this. Using private information as leverage is not who I wish to be, and the law is reasonably clear on what constitutes misuse of such material in any case. But I kept it because I knew that one day you might need to protect yourself, and I wanted you to have the means to do so. The cabinet labeled with my children's names contains documentation of financial arrangements and personal decisions that each of them would strongly prefer not to become public. I'm not asking you to use this. I'm asking you to know it exists and to use that knowledge. If Edward or Victoria or James ever make your life in any way more difficult than it already is. Now, for the most important thing, the last thing I want to say to you. I came to Lamere for the first time 6 months after we were married. My great-aunt Constance, you never met her. She died before we were together, left me this cottage with a letter that said, "Give this to someone you love more than your comfort. It is too good a place to shelter anything less." For 42 years, Eleanor, I brought this cottage closer and closer to what I wanted it to be. I planted the garden with plants I chose because they were the kinds of plants you love. I watched you in the Kensington garden for years to understand what you loved and why. I filled the bookshelves with books I thought you want to read. I took every photograph in this house with the knowledge that it would hang here, that I was building a portrait of you in the place I was building for you. I came here every month for 42 years, and I sat in that chair where you were sitting. And I thought about you, about the life you were living in Kensington while I was here, about whether I was doing the right thing in keeping this secret or whether I was being the coward I suspected myself of being, about whether love expressed secretly and structurally was worth more or less than love expressed openly and without protection. I could never entirely answer that question. I want to be honest with you about that. What I know is this. You were the only entirely real thing in my professional life. The career, the reputation, the chambers, the cases, the colleagues, the invitations, the dinners, the appearances, all of it was a performance brilliantly maintained, genuinely accomplished, but a performance nonetheless. The bar is a world of performance. I was extremely good at it, and it cost me something I cannot fully account for. You did not perform. You were simply completely, entirely yourself, and that self was extraordinary. In ways I don't think anyone ever told you clearly enough, and I failed you most in this. In not telling you, every day, in terms that left no room for misunderstanding. That you were the most remarkable person I knew, and that I was fortunate beyond any accounting to have been chosen by you. I was afraid of my children's judgment. I'm ashamed of this now. I prioritized their conditional approval over the woman who had given me her unconditional love. And that was a failure of character that I carried with me every day, and that I tried in this cottage, in this room, to make some reparation for. I cannot be brave in life. I hope I have managed to be clever in death. This cottage is yours. This land is yours. The documentation in these cabinets is yours. The knowledge that you were loved completely, privately, consistently across 42 years is yours. It was always yours. I am only sorry I was not better at saying it out loud. In the places where saying it out loud would have cost me something. You deserve someone who would have chosen you openly, loudly, without negotiation from the start. You deserve that, and I gave you something less, and I will not excuse it. But this is what I can give you now. This valley, this cottage, this study full of documents that constitute a kind of armor. And this letter, which is the most honest thing I have ever written, because the living always have to be careful and the dead, finally, can tell the truth. Take this place and make it yours. Not mine, yours. Fill it with your own books and your own paintings and your own garden and your own life. Let be the thing I couldn't give you while I was breathing. A place that is entirely, unambiguously, unquestionably yours. And forgive me if you can. Not immediately. In your own time. When you're ready. I understand if that takes a while. With all my love. With every bit of it. Across whatever distance there now is between us. Yours completely and always. Arthur. Eleanor read the letter once through with tears falling steadily and unremarked. She read it a second time, more slowly, stopping at certain phrases, to hold them in her mind and turn them in the light and understand what she was being given. She read it a third time, very slowly, with the precision of a woman who has spent 42 years, learning to hear what is said beneath the words. And this time, she heard everything. When she looked up, Meredith was in the doorway with 2 fresh cups of tea. He was a complicated man, Meredith said. Yes, Eleanor said. He was. But his love for you was not complicated. That part was simple and true. And anyone in this village who ever listened to him talk about his wife could have told you so. Eleanor set the letter carefully on the desk. She reached up and turned on the banker's lamp. In its green light, she looked at the filing cabinets Arthur had described. She opened the first drawer of the first cabinet, the deed to Wren Cottage and its land. In her name only, dated the 14th of September, 1983, 6 months after their wedding. The conveyance so carefully executed, the legal structure so thoroughly built that she could see at a glance. Why no solicitor in London could have found a crack in it. The second drawer, the maintenance trust documentation. 50 years of provision, fully funded, independently administered, requiring nothing from her. The third cabinet, the sensitive material. She looked at the tabs. Old files, newspaper cuttings, financial records, correspondence, and understood, without reading them in detail, that Arthur had spent 5 decades doing what barristers do. Watching, listening, documenting, understanding the full shape of every situation, before deciding what, if anything, to do with what he knew. The fourth cabinet, a folder thicker than the others, labeled in Arthur's hand. Edward, Victoria, James, trust documentation and personal records. Eleanor sat at the desk with this folder and opened it carefully. What she found inside took her the better part of an hour to read through properly. Arthur had given his children, with the precision of a master craftsman, exactly what they wanted. He had given it to them in a form that would take everything they had to handle. Edward's investment portfolio, £4.1 million, was structured in a trust, so thoroughly conditioned that accessing it required annual documentation of professional conduct, independently verified, administered by a retired judge of Arthur's selection, whose reputation for rigorous ethical standards was nationally known. Edward would spend the next decade of his professional life being assessed for worthiness to access money he believed was already his. The judge would be thorough. Victoria's inheritance carried requirements around financial transparency and family relationship stability that 3 divorces and an estrangement from her eldest child had already made nearly impossible to satisfy. The trustees had the authority to defer distributions indefinitely if the conditions were not met. Victoria would discover this at the first distribution date. James's trust required his active, hands-on management of the investment vehicles within it. If he failed to manage them personally and demonstrably, if he delegated, if he stepped back, if he treated the money as passive income rather than an active responsibility, the trust would automatically dissolve and the funds would transfer to a charitable foundation, supporting legal aid for those who could not otherwise afford representation. Arthur had selected this charity specifically and had funded it separately as well. Eleanor suspected he had done this with a quiet, lawyerly satisfaction. The Kensington townhouse, the heritage listing Arthur had placed on it 15 years ago, quietly, through channels that would not be visible until a potential sale triggered the searches. The listing meant the property could not be sold quickly. It meant committee review. It meant period sensitivity assessments. It meant neighborhood consultation processes that had been designed in the specific context of Kensington's conservation framework to be extremely thorough and extremely slow. It also meant, and this was the detail that made Eleanor close the folder and sit back in Arthur's worn leather chair and breathe very carefully for a moment, that the substantial mortgage Arthur had taken out against the property 18 months ago was now the problem of the people who had inherited it. The mortgage repayments alone would make the carrying costs of the property prohibitive. Edward, Victoria, and James had inherited, without knowing it, a house that would cost them far more than they had bargained for, and which they could not sell quickly enough to escape. Arthur had given them what they had always wanted, in the precise form that would show them, gradually, inexpensively, what wanting certain things actually costs. Eleanor sat in the study for a long time. The banker's lamp cast its green light across the desk. Outside, the valley had gone dark in the way valleys go dark. Quickly, completely, as though a decision has been made. Then she started to laugh. Not in triumph, exactly. Not in the way of someone who has won a competition. More like the laughter of someone who has been carrying something extremely heavy for a very long time and has just set it down, and in the moment of setting it down, has grasped the full absurdity of the carrying. She laughed until her chest ached and her eyes were running, and she heard Meredith come to the study doorway to check on her, and she looked up and saw Meredith's face, which was moving between concern and understanding, and then, as she grasped what she was seeing, toward its own quiet amusement, and they looked at each other for a moment. And then they were both laughing in the green light of Arthur's desk lamp, in the hidden study of a hidden cottage in a Welsh valley, laughing at the extraordinary patience and the meticulous, legal, entirely brilliant love of Arthur Morrison Whitfield. The first 2 weeks in Landmere were a kind of careful unfolding. The cottage was warm, well-maintained, genuinely habitable, not just barely so, but comfortably, abundantly so, the way of places that have been loved into readiness. Eleanor moved through the rooms slowly. In the first days, not yet quite rearranging anything, not quite ready to assert herself over Arthur's arrangement of the space, but learning it, learning where the light came from at different hours, learning the particular acoustic of the stone walls, the way sound moved differently. Through a room with thick walls and old glass than through the plasterboard of a Kensington townhouse. Learning the sounds the valley made, the stream she had heard from the car on the first day, which ran along the western edge of the property and which she found on the second morning, when she walked the boundary of the land in the early light with mud on her boots, and her breath making brief clouds in the cold air. She had not walked her own land before. She had managed gardens, not land. 184 acres was a different order of relationship with a piece of earth. She walked its perimeter over several days, in stages, and understood gradually that what Arthur had been maintaining all these years was not simply a cottage, but an entire ecological world, mature woodland, an open grassland, and a valley stream. And the clearing where the house stood and the old orchard she found on the third day. Half a dozen gnarled apple trees, whose varieties she could not immediately identify, but which she decided, learn. Meredith came every morning with fresh bread. She did not push or explain or overvisit. She came, left the bread, had a cup of tea, and went back to the bakery. In those cups of tea, she told Eleanor, in small increments, about Arthur's life in Landmere. The church roof, 3 years ago. Arthur had heard that the fund was short by a significant amount and that the repairs might need to be deferred again. They had already been deferred twice and had written a check through an intermediary, requesting no acknowledgement, no plaque, no public record. Daniel Price had figured it out eventually and had tried to thank him. Arthur had told him, apparently, that a congregation shouldn't have to worry about the rain when they were trying to think about more important things. He had not wanted to discuss it further. The scholarship fund for students over 22 years from Landmere and the surrounding villages. First-generation university students, all of them. Arthur had structured it through the local bank so that his name would not be attached. Meredith had worked it out by noticing that the timing correlated with Arthur's visits and by knowing Arthur well enough to understand what he considered worth doing with surplus money. He had not confirmed it when she asked him. He had changed the subject with practiced ease. The library. 500 books on a wet Tuesday morning in October, 6 years ago. Arthur arriving with the boot of his car, full of boxes and a check for the remainder. The young librarian, her name was Rhiannon, Eleanor learned, had tried to make a proper ceremony of it. Arthur had declined the ceremony, accepted a cup of tea, looked around the library with what Rhiannon described as the expression of someone who was genuinely pleased with how things had turned out and gone back to the cottage. He talked about you in the bakery, Meredith told her one morning. Every single visit. He would have tea and he would tell me things you had said or done or grown. He would show me photographs on his telephone. He had a particular system for them. He kept a folder just of photos of you that he'd taken without you knowing. He'd scroll through and tell me the story of each one. This is Eleanor in the garden. In the spring, look at the light. This is Eleanor at the gallery. She didn't know I was watching. He said you were the most interesting person he knew in that London. Didn't see it because London only saw Mrs. Arthur Whitfield. And you had learned, for his sake, to be very good at being Mrs. Arthur Whitfield. And that this had cost you something he couldn't entirely account for, but felt the weight of daily. Eleanor listened to this. She looked out the kitchen window at the garden, where the March light was doing its early spring work, gentle, non-committal, full of the suggestion of warmth rather than warmth itself. You should have just told me, she said. You should have brought me here and said, this is what I've been building for you. This is how I love you. You didn't have to wait until I died. Meredith nodded. He knew that. He said it to me once, that he lived with the knowledge of his own cowardice every day, and that Landmere was his way of making reparation for something he couldn't make reparation for openly. He was a proud man in some ways and not a brave one in others. He chose the ways his pride would serve him and let the bravery fall short in the places it would have cost him most. That's not uncommon in my experience. It's just that most people don't build a valley cottage in compensation. Eleanor smiled, the first genuine, unreserved smile she had produced in many weeks. No, she said. I suppose they don't. Gerald Hawthorne called on a Thursday morning 3 weeks after Eleanor had arrived in Landmere. Mrs. Whitfield, I'm glad to hear you're settled in. I need to tell you something. Edward has instructed a firm of solicitors, a large one, city-based, known for estate litigation, to examine the grounds for challenging your ownership of the Landmere property. His argument is that any property of significant value that changed hands during a marriage should be considered a joint marital asset, regardless of the formal structure of the conveyance. Eleanor was standing in the kitchen when he called, looking out at the garden, where the snowdrops she had found along the south wall were just finishing, and the first crocuses were beginning, purple and white and the particular deep yellow. That always seems improbable in March. Too warm for the season, too committed. She said, Gerald, will you explain to me why Arthur placed the property in my name in 1983? Because he conveyed it to you as a gift, Hawthorne said, before any argument could be made. About marital property. The documentation of that conveyance is comprehensive and watertight. It predates the marriage by 6 months. It predates any joint asset argument by 42 years. Edward's solicitors will find nothing to hold on to, and, in my professional opinion, they will advise him of this within a month. Then let him try, Eleanor said calmly. I have the original documentation. I have a duplicate set, and I have a filing cabinet full of material that my husband spent 5 decades keeping and that I intend to use. If anyone makes this more complicated than it needs to be. I know, Gerald said, and for the record, I want you to understand something. I argued against the language of that will. I argued against it very directly. Arthur listened to my objections with complete courtesy, considered them for approximately 30 seconds, and declined to revise a single word. He said the language was not about you. He said it was about making sure they found no argument to use against what he was really doing. He said, Gerald, the will is a misdirection. Let them have what they see. What matters is what they can't see. I understand that now, Eleanor said. I know you do, Gerald said. For what it's worth, and I know it is perhaps not worth much. Given the way things went, he was one of the most devoted people I have known. In 50 years of legal practice, he came to my office every year to update the arrangements. For Landmere, every year, without exception, he never missed. He brought photographs of improvements he'd made to the property, progress on the garden, new photographs for the walls. He treated it as the most important client matter I handled, even though I was never paid a penny for any of it. He said some things you do because they are right. Eleanor thanked him. She stood for a while after the call ended, looking at the garden. Then she went to the study and took out the folder labeled with Arthur's children's names and set it on the desk. She looked at it for a long time without opening it. She thought about Arthur's letter. I never used this information. That would have been wrong. She thought. He left me the choice because he trusted me to make it. She put the folder back in the filing cabinet. She closed the drawer. She would keep it there. She would know it was there. And if they forced her hand, if Edward's solicitors pushed past what Gerald had described as a very limited legal argument, in a territory that actually threatened her security, she would open that drawer again. But she would not open it today. For days later, a large car appeared at the end of the track from the village. Eleanor watched it from the upstairs window, recognizing Edward's dark saloon, before she could make out the faces inside it. Victoria was with him. James was in the back, looking out the window at the valley with an expression she couldn't quite read from this distance. She watched them park in the clearing and get out. She watched their faces as they looked up at Wren Cottage, the whole of it, the stone, the slate, the intact casement windows, the garden walls, the scale of the clearing, the old trees standing sentinel at its perimeter. She watched the confidence with which they had arrived encounter the reality of what they were looking at. Victoria's face was the most revealing. Eleanor had known Victoria for 42 years. She had watched her perform certainty in many registers across many situations. The certainty with which Victoria had described this property A wreck, practically uninhabitable, not worth the hassle of selling. Met the actual property and did not survive the meeting. Eleanor came downstairs and opened the door before they knocked. The positioning mattered. She had decided this upstairs, watching them cross the clearing. They would knock, and she would answer, and the scene would be structured on their terms. Or she would be at the door when they arrived, and the scene would be structured on hers. She chose hers. "Hello," she said, in a voice she had developed over 42 years of being a barrister's wife. The voice that was warm and composed and entirely unbiddable beneath the warmth. "Do come in. I'll make tea." She made the tea in the kitchen, unhurried, with the entire knowledge of the filing cabinet. In the study operating in her mind as a kind of background score, present, informing her tone, not yet deployed. She carried the tray into the sitting room and set it on the low table, between the chairs with the ease of someone who belongs completely in a space. She poured. She sat. The three of them looked at her, and she could see them recalibrating. The woman they had put in the second row at the funeral. The woman they had been permitted to leave in the house for 30 days, while they walked through it measuring walls. The woman who had driven away from Kensington with 3 suitcases and an envelope containing a rusty key. She was not the same woman now. The same person, yes. The same intelligence, the same accumulated competence of someone who has managed a complex household for 4 decades. But something had changed in her bearing. In the weeks since she had arrived in Landmere, and they could all 3 see it, even if they could not have said precisely what it was. Edward cleared his throat. "Eleanor, we've come to discuss the property. We believe there may have been a misunderstanding about its value, and we think Father would have wanted a more equitable arrangement. This property was placed in my name as a gift in September of 1983, Eleanor said. "I have the original conveyance document, the bank records from the transaction, the legal correspondence between my husband and Gerald Hawthorne himself, who is still practicing and who has a complete duplicate of every document in this study. Any argument that this property constitutes a marital asset will fail because it was conveyed to me 6 months before our marriage made such an argument possible." Victoria opened her mouth. "I also have," Eleanor continued, "the detailed trust documentation for each of your inheritances. I spent an evening reading it carefully. I think you will find, when your own solicitors examine the conditions, that the next several years of your lives will be considerably more complicated than you currently anticipate. Your father was a very thorough man." She picked up the folder, the one she had closed, and returned to the filing cabinet, and retrieved, after all, on the morning she had known they were coming, because composure requires preparation, and preparation requires honesty about what you are facing, and placed it on the table between them. "This folder," she said, "contains documentation your father accumulated over 50 years of legal practice, information relating to personal and professional decisions made by each of you that you would prefer not to have examined in any public forum. He never used this material. I respect that choice. He was a more patient person than I need to be." She looked at each of them in turn. "So I am offering you what your father could not, which is directness. Walk away. Accept the will as it stands. Manage your trusts. Maintain your townhouse. Discover over the next several years whether the inheritance you fought for is the inheritance you wanted. Live your lives. Leave me to live mine. Or engage a litigation firm to challenge this property, in which case I will have no option but to defend myself using every resource available to me, including the material in this folder. And the outcome of that process will be unpleasant for all of us, but significantly more unpleasant for you than for me." The room was quiet for a long moment. The clock on the mantel ticked. From somewhere outside, faintly, a wood pigeon was considering its options. "We need to discuss this privately," Edward said. His voice had lost its chamber's authority. He sounded, Eleanor thought, like a man who has understood for the first time the full cost of something he has committed to. Of course, Eleanor said, take all the time you need. But before you go, there is one thing I want to say. Not as a threat, not as a negotiating position, simply as something true that I think should be said. Your father loved you in the way that complicated people love the people they feel responsible for, with difficulty and distance and a great deal of managed behavior. And not enough simple warmth, perhaps, but genuinely. He worried about you. He wanted you to be well. He structured your inheritances the way he did. Not because he wanted to punish you, but because he understood from decades of watching people handle inherited money, what it tends to do to people who haven't earned it. And he tried to build in the kind of friction that keeps people doing things that matter. You may disagree with his methods. You may be angry about the conditions. That is understandable. But he did it from love, in his way. She paused. He loved me differently. He loved me without the conditions. He loved me in private, in this valley, across 42 years of monthly visits, and photographs, and a garden, and a study full of letters he never sent me. Because he was afraid of what your reactions would cost him. He loved me with a completeness he was too afraid to show publicly. And I have decided, sitting in this cottage with all the evidence of that love around me, that I am willing to forgive him for the fear. It took me a while, but I have arrived there. I hope you can, eventually, find some way to forgive him for the conditions he placed on your inheritance. I think it would make your lives easier. I think it's what he would have wanted, though I recognize I'm not the right person to tell you what he wanted. She stood. She walked to the front door and held it open. The March air came in from the valley, cold and clean, and carrying the smell of the stream, and the old oaks and the earth beginning to rouse itself from winter. Edward, Victoria, and James filed out into the clearing. They walked to the car. They did not speak to each other until they were inside it. Eleanor stood in the doorway and watched the car move back up the track toward the village. When it was out of sight, she went inside and closed the door. She sat in the armchair by the fireplace, the one Arthur had positioned to catch the morning light. And she looked at the photographs of herself on the walls, and she allowed herself, for the first time since arriving in Landmere, to cry without a specific reason. Not for grief, not for relief, not for anger or justice or the complex emotional mathematics of what had happened in Gerald Hawthorne's conference room. Just because she was 74 years old and she had been through something enormous. And the enormous thing was over, and now there was a valley and a cottage and a garden, and a community that had been waiting for her, and she was finally here. Gerald Hawthorne called a week later. Edward had instructed his solicitors to withdraw. The estate was settled and closed. Gerald had the paperwork completed by the end of the week. What happened next happened slowly and mattered because of the slowness. The Kensington townhouse eventually sold, not quickly as Edward had planned, but after 9 months of Heritage Committee reviews and structural assessments, and neighborhood consultations that moved at the measured pace of processes, designed by people who believe that significant decisions about significant buildings should not be rushed. When it finally sold, the proceeds after the mortgage settlement, and the legal fees and the estate agent costs and the historic preservation compliance work were substantially less than the siblings had calculated. They had learned, by the end of the process, some things about the difference between the value of a property and the cost of owning one. The trust restrictions had proved to be exactly as demanding as Arthur had designed them. Edward's annual reviews with the retired judge were difficult conversations. Victoria's trustees were thorough about the family relationship requirements. James had discovered that actively managing an investment portfolio is work, specifically the kind of work that cannot be performed from the sidelines, and was finding this discovery challenging. Arthur's revenge was not dramatic. It was the quiet, grinding, perfectly legal revenge of excellent planning. And it had the particular quality of all the best long games. The players on the receiving end understood what was happening, but could find no move to escape it. Eleanor knew most of this because Gerald kept her informed. She did not dwell on it. She had enough to occupy her in Landmere. The garden was the first project because gardening is the right size of occupation for someone recovering from something. It asks enough of you: physical work, attention, patience, the willingness to accept that some things take longer than you want them to keep the mind from spinning, but not so much that it crowds out the processing. That needs to happen in the quieter hours. She hired two young people from the village, a man called Idris who knew about dry stone walls, and an 18-year-old called Saren who turned out to have an instinctive feel for plants. That made Eleanor think of herself at that age, before she had been anyone's wife or anyone's manager, when she had simply been someone who grew things because growing things was good. They worked through March and April and into the May of Eleanor's first spring in Landmere. The roses were cut back hard and staked properly and given room to breathe. The stone paths were cleared, re-leveled, and pointed with lime mortar. The fountain was cleaned, its basin relined, the mechanism, a simple gravity system. From the stream above, cleared of 20 years of organic matter and coaxed back into function. On the day the water ran clear from the fountain mouth, Saren clapped her hands, and Idris looked at it with the expression of someone who has restored something and finds the restoration sufficient reward in itself. And Eleanor stood in the garden, in the May sunshine, and thought, this is what it is to make something yours. She updated the kitchen while keeping everything she loved about it. The range was serviced and encouraged back to its full capacity. The farmhouse sink was regrouted and polished. She replaced the tile behind it with hand-painted tiles from a workshop in Aberystwyth whose maker, a small, fierce woman called Katrin, had spent 3 hours discussing the right shade of blue with Eleanor before agreeing that they had found it. The open shelves gained more of Katrin's work, serving dishes, mugs, the particular heavy bowl that Eleanor discovered was the right shape for bread making, which she had taken up because the bakery was a 15-minute walk away. And she had time now, actual unhurried time, the likes of which she had not had in 42 years. She chose books of the shelves, her books, the ones she had been meaning to read for decades, and had sometimes set aside for more appropriate choices, books that were now spread across the shelves, in the order she had placed them rather than any order of display or performance. George Eliot and Penelope Fitzgerald and Marilyn Robinson, and a section of Welsh poetry she had discovered through Rhiannon at the library, and which was teaching her something she had not expected to learn at 74 about where grief and beauty meet. She kept Arthur's photographs, all of them on all the walls, but she added her own work beside them, the watercolors from the 80s, brought from the cardboard box she had carried in the boot of the Volvo, now framed and hung with the matter-of-factness of someone who has decided that 40 years is long enough to keep something private. She added prints from the Tate and from a small gallery in Brecon that she visited on a Saturday in June and spent 3 hours in and bought more from than she had intended. She added a painting by Saren, who turned out to draw as instinctively as she gardened. A small oil of the valley in early morning, the mist in the trees, and the light beginning. That Eleanor bought for much more than Saren wanted to charge for it. The community of Landmere opened itself to Eleanor the way communities open, to people who are genuinely present, not in a rush, not with any performance of welcome, but steadily, over months, through the accumulation of small exchanges and regular appearances, and the growing recognition that this woman who had arrived in March with her 3 suitcases, and her 2 boxes, and her 12-year-old Volvo intended to stay. She volunteered at the library on Monday and Thursday mornings. Rhiannon, who was 29 and had opinions about almost everything and was usually right, introduced her to the readers group that met on the first Tuesday of each month. In the back room of the pub, and the readers group became the conversation Eleanor had not known. She needed serious, arguing, occasionally heated, always interested, always worth having. She joined the allotment committee. The allotment committee met with the seriousness of an organization that understands its importance and wishes this to be clear to everyone. Eleanor attended 3 meetings before she was asked to take the minutes, which she interpreted as acceptance. She attended the church on Sundays. Daniel Price, the vicar, was 38 and had the specific quality of intelligence that combines genuine faith with genuine doubt and has made its peace with the combination. He found Eleanor after her 3rd Sunday service and asked her if she would like to have lunch, and she said yes, and they talked for 2 hours about Arthur and about Landmere and about what it is to arrive somewhere in your 70s and find that it is where you were always supposed to be. Daniel said he believed in late arrivals. Eleanor said she was willing to believe that too, on the evidence. For the first time in her adult life, Eleanor Grace Whitfield had friends who were hers. Not Arthur's colleagues' wives. Not the social network of a barrister's household. Not people who knew her as Mrs. Whitfield and would have struggled to describe her otherwise. Meredith, who had become in 6 months what Eleanor's brother Peter had been. The person you called when something happened that you needed to tell someone immediately. Rhiannon, who recommended books with the authority of someone who reads as a serious moral act, and who Eleanor suspected would become, in time, someone she knew for the rest of her life. Saren, who came twice a week to work in the garden and who had taken to appearing on other days as well, ostensibly to check on specific plants, but actually Eleanor understood, because she had found in Eleanor's kitchen a warmth and attention that she was young enough to need and old enough to know she had found something good. Idris, who said very little, but came whenever something needed doing and did it with complete competence, and who had once, on an afternoon in July when the valley was green and the stream was low and loud, told Eleanor that his grandmother had been the same kind of person, someone who made places worth being in, and who had then gone back to work as though he had said nothing. One afternoon in October, when the valley was in the full extravagance of its autumn, the oaks going amber, the rowans red, the bracken on the hillside the exact color of the rugs on Eleanor's floors, as though Arthur had chosen them with this view in mind. She was sorting through the remaining contents of the study drawers when she found a small envelope tucked behind a false panel in the bottom of the last drawer. Sealed, labeled, in Arthur's hand, for Eleanor's future. Open when you are ready. She made tea. She sat in the leather chair. She looked at the envelope for a little while, in the way of someone who has learned that some things are better approached with stillness, rather than urgency, who has learned this, in fact, in the valley of Landmere over the past 7 months. Then she opened it. Inside, the deed to 12 acres on the eastern edge of Landmere, an old stone barn and a small attached cottage, both currently unoccupied, currently in reasonable structural condition according to a surveyor's report dated 2 years ago. The deed in her name only. Paid in full. A second document, the establishment papers for a trust fund of £400,000. Named, in Arthur's careful legal language, the Eleanor Grace Whitfield Foundation. Purpose, to fund whatever projects or purposes Eleanor Grace Whitfield determines to be of value in her own life and the lives of others. And a note, one side of paper, Arthur's hand, for your future, not mine, yours. You have spent 42 years in the work of sustaining my life. You have done it with a skill and a grace and a generosity that I see clearly now. Writing this, in a way I failed to see clearly enough when it might have done you some good. This is your blank page. The barn and the cottage are yours to do with as you choose. The trust is yours to direct as you see fit. I have put no conditions on either. The only advice I will offer is this. Build something that only you could build. Something that comes from who you actually are, not who you were asked to be, not the role you learned to play, so well that you sometimes forgot it was a role, but the person who has been waiting, rather patiently, to find out what she does. When the space is finally entirely her own. I cannot tell you what that is. I will not presume to, even now, but I suspect you already know. I think you have probably always known. I think the knowing has simply been waiting for a room of sufficient size. With love, with gratitude for 42 years of the best part of my life. Arthur. Eleanor sat with the letter in the October light. The valley outside was going gently about. Its business, which in October consists largely of letting things go beautifully. The stream was audible through the open window. The wood pigeons were in the high oaks. Somewhere on the hillside, sheep were maintaining their considered opinion about something. She knew what she wanted to do. She had been circling it for weeks, knowing it was there, but not quite looking at it directly. Now she looked at it. A retreat, a place for women like her, women who had spent their years in the sustaining work of other people's lives and had arrived at a point, through loss or upheaval or simply the slow passage of time, where they needed somewhere to come to. Women who needed to remember who they were when you took away all the roles. Women in the particular vulnerability of older age, who needed community and time and a place that asked nothing of them except their presence. Widows who were rebuilding. Women leaving difficult situations. Women who had been very good at being someone else for a very long time, and who were discovering, as Eleanor had discovered, that the self underneath was not gone, was still there, still intact, still interested in things, still capable of growing and learning, and being delighted, still entirely worth knowing. She would convert the barn into a main space, a gathering room, a kitchen, a library. She would restore the cottage to comfortable bedrooms. She would build a proper garden. She would create something with Arthur's money and her own 42 years of understanding. What it is to make a place where people feel genuinely held, genuinely seen, genuinely at ease. She would call it Constance House, after the great aunt who had believed this valley was worth sheltering love in. It would be Arthur's final gift, transformed by Eleanor's hands, into something that served people Arthur had never met and couldn't have imagined, which was, she thought, exactly the right use for a gift given in love. She called Meredith that evening and told her. Meredith was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I'll come over tomorrow morning and we'll work out who to talk to." Idris knows construction. Rhiannon knows everyone in the county who does anything worthwhile. Sarah will want to do the garden, obviously. And there's a woman in Brecken who runs a social enterprise that helps women leaving difficult situations, who you absolutely need to meet. I'll call her tonight. That is how things begin in Landmere. Simply, practically, with people who show up. As the November dark came early into the valley, and Eleanor lit the fire in the sitting room, and sat with her tea in Arthur's armchair with the photographs looking at her from the walls. Her own face at 31, at 47, at 60, at an age she could not immediately date, but which she recognized by the garden she was standing in as sometime in her early 50s. That winter she had started the Espaliered apple and had been so pleased with herself. And here was the evidence that Arthur had been watching her be pleased with herself, and had thought it worth recording, had thought her worth recording, had spent 40 years thinking her worth the frame and the shelf and the drive across England and into Wales. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, the solicitor's office, the brown envelope, the iron key, the 30 days of being unmade, the drive into Wales, the valley opening below her on Ashbourne Lane, Meredith coming down the track with a basket, Arthur's letter in the green light of the banker's lamp. She thought about what she had lost. She thought about what she had found. She thought about the difference between the two, how she had believed in that Kensington car park, that they were the same thing, that what she had lost was everything, and what she had found would be nothing but the small, cold fact of survival. She had been wrong about that. She was glad to have been wrong. Arthur had been deeply flawed. She understood this now, without qualification and without resentment. Or with resentment, sometimes on mornings when the weight of 42 years of living quietly in someone else's world pressed down on her with particular insistence. but not with the resentment that poisons. With a clear-eyed, compassionate, fully informed recognition of a woman who had loved someone for 42 years and understood him well enough by now to know that understanding and forgiving are not the same thing, but can, over time, come to occupy the same space. He had been afraid of his children's judgment. He had chosen their conditional approval over her again and again in the public rooms of their life together. And this had been a failure, a genuine, significant, costly failure. And he had known it, and he had lived with the knowledge. And he had tried in the only way available to him to make it right. He had built her a fortress while she believed she was a guest. He had given her freedom disguised as abandonment. He had hidden evidence of her worth in a place where jealousy could not reach it, and had trusted her to be strong enough to find it and wise enough to understand it. Not just property or money, not just the practical security of a valley cottage in Wales, but this, the knowledge, finally and without qualification, that she had mattered, that she had been seen, that the person who was supposed to see her, who had committed, in front of witnesses, to seeing her, had seen her clearly and completely, even when he had not been brave enough to say so in the places where saying so would have cost him. She was 74 years old. She had spent 42 years being excellent at someone else's life. Now, in this valley, in this cottage, in this community of bread bakers and librarians, and dry stone wall builders and young women who could feel what plants need. Now she was beginning, with appropriate caution and genuine excitement, and no deadline, to find out what she could be excellent at in her own. And she was discovering, morning by morning, project by project, cup of tea by cup of tea, that the answer was more than she had expected. That 74 was not a summary. That it was, as it turned out, rather a good place to start. The fires settled in the grate. The valley was full of quiet November dark. Eleanor Grace Whitfield finished her tea, set the cup on the side table, looked at her own face on the walls, at the accumulated evidence of a life that had been, for all its difficulty, a life that had been lived and loved and seen, and went to make another cup. Just one tonight, just hers, but with no sense of lack in the single cup, only the quiet, unhurried rightness of someone who has finally come home.